Good morning, everyone. We are part of Group 3. I am Brianna, and together with Lindy, we will be reporting regarding the colonial sugar production in the Spanish Philippines. Religious corporations were very powerful in the time of the Spanish tyranny. In fact, the best tract of lands in some provinces were in their hands. The friars claimed that the reason these estates were doing so well was because of their supervision. But Rizal proved that the argument was wrong. As evidence, agriculture could prosper without friar involvement, as Taal, Palayan, and Lipa were better than the friar haciendas of Pawan and Lian because they were cultivated entirely by the natives without monkish interference. By 1845, sugar was being produced in 9 provinces, for most of which were Pampanga, Cebu, and Bulacan. In the late 1850s, Negros, whose sugar was exported via the port of Iloilo, joined this club of major sugar producers. In Rizal's essay on indolence, to counter the argument that friars were absolutely necessary for economic advancement, he chose to hold up non-friar haciendas in other parts of Batangas. This was to shed light on agricultural activities that thrived outside of the friar estates. The various sugar-producing regions can be thought of as existing on a continuum, with Calamba and Negros acting as the polar opposites. The Dominican owners of Calamba relied on a sector of wealthy leaseholders known as inquilinos, generally local mestizos, who mobilized a stratum of subtenants on sharecropping arrangements. In Negros, the sugar planters, also known as the hacienderos, comprised a multi-ethnic immigrant class of landowners, most of whom directly hired their own tenants, while others employed overseers who supervised the tenantry.
Both locales were attached to global capitalism since sugar from both regions was slated for export, but their modes of articulation were very different. In Calamba, Chinese mestizo lessees relied on their own capital or on Chinese moneylenders and middlemen who brought the goods to foreign merchants in Manila. However, the sugar haciendas in Negros relied on loans and capital advances that were sourced directly from merchant houses based in Iloilo on the nearby island of Panay. Those in Calamba deliberately targeted a religious order that Spanish authorities later supported to protect the colonial state. Those in Negros had no friar order for an antagonist and no political agenda. The sugar industry of Negros developed in the late 19th century in the shadow of the central state, in contrast to Calamba, which, like other monastic estates, symbolized the state.
According to Dennis Roth, the Hacienda de Calamba passed ownership from one lay Spaniard to another until in 1759, its destitute owner turned over the hacienda to the Jesuits in exchange for the room and board in the monastery for a lifetime. The government confiscated the property when the Jesuits were expelled from the Philippines in 1768. Roth stated that the Calamba's economy had grown far beyond its former restricted limits by the middle of the 19th century, wherein many new families migrated, including the ancestors of Jose Rizal. The Recollects did not acquire any monastic estate in Negros because of the underpopulated state when they first arrived there. However, many Recollect priests engaged in building basic infrastructures such as roads and potable water facilities. Fernando Cuenca, a priest of Minuluan, also known as Talisay today, later became heavily involved in supporting sugarcane cultivation, including on his own private properties.
In Negros, as well as in Calamba, the push to produce sugar did not come from the state but from the market. Negros continued to produce food crops, particularly in a few small towns on the southern portion of the island, where peasants almost exclusively grew either rice or corn. On the west coast of the island, 8 municipalities became virtually monocrop economies. The largest sugar producers were Minuluan, Saravia, and Silay. However, there were 15 towns that grew a combination of sugar and rice. In these towns, the smallest farms were devoted to rice, while the biggest farms planted sugarcane. In Negros, there were various schemes to acquire land. These include ranging from outright purchase to leasing, land grabbing, acquiring foreclosed property, and opening up new land. The largest property owner was Isidro de la Rama, who owned a total of 1,260 hectares. According to Roth, the total income of all friar orders was no more than 10% derived from sugar. The 3 largest monastic estates in Laguna Province, including the adjoining Dominican estates of Binian, Santa Rosa, and Calamba had significant production of sugar, which became extensive in the late 19th century. The growth in sugarcane cultivation was most spectacular in Calamba, considering the Inquilinos were more dependent on sugarcane than most tenants of other friar estates. However, unlike in Negros, there was only one way to acquire land for sugar cultivation in a friar estate, which is to enter a leasehold contract, known as inquilinato, with a hacienda owner through friar administrator, also known as hacendero. The Rizal's farm holdings were considered huge by Calamba standard, but their land holdings did not measure up to the largest properties in Negros. The Hacienda de Calamba's income from sugar increased from a few hundred pesos in the late 1830s to more than 40,000 pesos in 1895. According to Ross, the rent for sugar lands doubled, from 15 pesos for a quinyon first-class land in the 1840s, it increased to 20, then 25, and finally 30 pesos, where it remained until the Revolution. If annual interest could not be paid, the rent for the following year was doubled, which happened in Calamba in 1886 and 1887.
In Calamba, the intermediate layer of inquilinos emerged in the first half of the 19th century. These lessees subdivided the leased property and entered into sharecropping arrangements with subtenants, peasants known as kasama. The landowner or lessee who entered into an arrangement with a kasama, usually on a 50-50 sharing of the produce, provided the latter with land as well as cash advances on production. For his part, the tenant as production partner was responsible for seedlings in the case of rice cultivation, the carabao, and farm implements. The Negros hacienderos practiced sharecropping, the system of cultivation that Robustiano Echaus and others referred to as the most common. They partitioned their sugar haciendas into farm lots that were cultivated directly by tenants. Same as the inquilinos in Calamba, the Negros sugar planters supplied their sharecroppers with work animals, farm equipment, and cash advance to attract them to remain on the farm. The regimentation of labor in a plantation system would have had to hurdle enormous difficulties because the fledgling sugar planter class in Negros was lack of hegemony at this state of history. Sharecropping was used by the majority of sugar haciendas in Negros until the shift to capital-intensive centrifugal milling in the 1930s, which rendered it ineffective due to the requirement for precisely timed planting and feeding of cut cane to the sugar centrals.
In Calamba, Chinese mestizo leaseholders usually entered agriculture with capital generated from commercial and other economic activities and were thus self-financing. The inquilinos borrowed money from Chinese moneylenders in Manila if the capital was insufficient. The Chinese or mestizos who were engaged in the purifying of sugar were the purchasers of these lots. Most of them sent an agent to buy as much of such sugar they required to keep their establishments at work. Foreign merchants possessed a commercial intelligence to make the sugar trade a success. In November 1884, Pasiano wrote to Jose Rizal about their financial difficulties. No steam-powered sugar mills existed in Calamba, so Pasiano had become alert to the need to improve the milling technology. Then, there was a series of evictions of inquilinos from the Hacienda de Calamba from 1888 to 1891 caused the replacement by Spanish inquilinos who were given loans by the Dominicans to install steam-driven mills. On the other hand, Negros experienced a period of enormous risk-taking. Many haciendas relied on the crude carabao-driven mills for making Muscovado sugar. But there were also many that had invested in steam mills. Given relatively easy access to capital in the late 1880s, there were 200 steam-powered mills and 30 hydraulic mills in addition to the 500 carabao-driven iron mills. The hacenderos were able to invest in new machinery in a way that was not possible in Calamba. Negros' sugar economy began to grow in earnest in the 1860s and 1870s, directly tied to the Iloilo-based foreign merchants.
McCoy has shown a remarkable connection between these Negros hacienderos and the Iloilo's pre-1855 elite. In 1861, Loney reported that the Iloilo elites were settling down in Negros together with peasant families who would serve as their share tenants. Despite the complex relationship between naturals and Chinese mestizos, they found themselves contending but also strategizing with each other in Negros. Moreover, Spaniards of many stripes sought their fortunes in Negros to become hacienderos. Chinese and other Europeans were also attracted to the sugar economy of Negros. The mixing of all of these diverse social categories transformed Negros into a giant colonial cockpit where members of these social categories intersected and intermingled but also segregated themselves. Negros served as a place for challenging colonial society's social stratification systems while simultaneously reaffirming, modifying, and reinscribing them. In the cockpit, money flowed, but other kinds of social relationships were made possible by taking part in a common gambit. In any case, Negros was an open society in the second half of the 19th century, despite its extreme inequality and its direct connection to the global market by foreign merchants. There, a classic plural society emerged with Peninsulars, Basques especially, and a select group of Recollect friars, Creoles, and Spanish mestizos, Chinese mestizos, naturals, Chinese traders, and a few Chinese landowners, and a handful of other Europeans and other immigrants seeking their fortunes in Negros, brought together by the market, but also competing with each other on issues related to but exceeding the market. In doing so, they effectively sidelined the state in Negros.
According to Pasiana Rizal, the controversy in Calamba, which started in 1883 or a couple years before the sugar prices declined in 1885, initially centered on rental payments, and the Hacienda administration's arbitrary practice of not issuing the usual receipts. Like the other friar estates, Calamba was a state-sanctioned enclave economy. During Rizal's visit to the homeland from August 1887 to February 1888, Rizal inspired the inquilinos in presenting their grievances against the Calamba Hacienda administration. They requested formal contracts or the sale of the land to whoever had cleared it after alleging that the hacienda's limits were improperly extended and rental fees that were excessive and arbitrarily raised. But the civil authorities were avoiding a possible confrontation with the Dominicans, leaving the people of Calamba high and dry. Pressed by the world sugar market and the hacienda, Rizal and other inquilinos saw the dispute as a way of challenging the colonial state and putting to the test Spain's policy of colonial assimilation. In contrast, there was no single Spanish colonial institution that became the concerted target of native resistance in Negros, where agricultural, economic, and technological conditions allowed the haciendas to weather the crisis of the 1880s. Hacenderos utilized various extra-legal means to obtain and expand their land holdings, running to the state only to serve as umpire in their intramurals over land. Controlling the labor force was a significant problem for the hacenderos since they lacked class power. The hacenderos requested Spanish Manila's participation in regulating labor in the 1880s, but the authorities balked and refrained from acting. The Spanish colonial state was far from being a developmental state due to a lack of capital and technical expertise which could not lend assistance to the sugar hacenderos. Yet, saw the foreign merchant houses as exerting a stranglehold on these planters. But the colonial state did not understand the urgent demand of Negros' sugar economy and did not show any appreciation for the international sugar market and foreign merchant houses in Iloilo. In the wake of the downfall of Spanish power and the presence of U.S. Expeditionary Force in Iloilo, the planters did not hesitate to form a government for Negros.
The Negros attracted migrants from adjacent islands who were lured by the market to establish sugar haciendas based mainly on sharecropping but with the capital and technology provided by foreign merchant houses. Each hacendero, even though wobbled by contradictions, thrived in anarchic ways to maximize their own individual. The sugar planters on Calamba relied on local capital and backward technology. Together with the sharecroppers, these planters were squarely under a religious corporation, the Dominican Republic, which pursued its own interest.
Now let's talk about the relation of the article to the current condition of our country. The article Colonial Sugar Production in the Spanish Philippines takes from Rizal's essay Sobre la Indolencia de los Filipinos, where he talked about the different circumstances on how the Spaniards acquired wealth, economic unrest, and the different social issues during the Spanish colonial era. However, the mentioned article focuses more on the agricultural expenditures that happened in this era, specifically on the lands of Calamba and Negros, where the practice of sugar production served as the main means of cash flows in the said regions. Upon reading and analyzing the assigned article, there were similarities and recurring themes with regards to the whole process of business and trade in this time and during Rizal's time. During the Spanish colonial era, there was only one way to acquire land for sugar cultivation in a friar estate in Calamba, which is to enter a leasehold contract with the hacienda owner to the administrator or friar administrator, also known as hacendero. These lease contracts would last for 3 years before they would be renewed and be leased out again. In Negros, you could acquire land by purchasing it or leasing it, opening up new lands, land grabbing, and acquiring foreclosed property. In today's time, these similar activities are also being implemented in order for new entrepreneurs who wish to start their own business venture, procure either land or building for them to conduct business. The process of leasing or renting out land or business is one of the most common ways to do so. The whole process on how former hacienderos in the Spanish times achieved wealth and prosperity from starting with small patches of land for sugar production can be seen in this generation, in big conglomerates such as the SM Group, Ayala Group, and many others that once started from a small business, then proceeding to become a nationally recognized corporation. Even though it has been a few centuries since the Spanish colonial era, the modality and business practices from the said era can still be seen in how modern business corporations function today.